Hello, I'm 𝗦𝘂𝘀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀, founder of Starlit Contracts. We're here to help you negotiate and use contracts with confidence. And this video is part of our Build the Foundation in Contracts program. Our topic is suspension. To summarize, a suspension is the ability of one or potentially the other party of the contract to pause the obligations under the contract for a period of time. How does it work in practice? Well, a party might be able to suspend the contract for convenience, or they might be able to suspend the contract due to a default by the other party. Typically, if you want such right to arise in a contract, then it's good to have an express contractual right. Now, it might be the case that an equivalent or a comparable right exists under the law that governs the contract, but you'd need to check for this. To look at a practical example, let's say that you're the supplier and I'm the customer, and you're providing services to me over the course of 6 months. Well, we might agree in the contract that I, as the customer, have the right to suspend the contract for a 1-month period at my convenience. So I'd notify you of the suspension, you would stop work for that 1-month period, and then once that 1-month period ends, then you would recommence the services. We will look at a suspension for default on the next slide. Is this something that you should care about? Well, when a party has a right to suspend, whether it's convenience or for default, you should be thinking about, should you have a right to receive compensation due to that suspension? Also, if you've got a performance obligation that needs to be delivered by a certain date or a certain milestone, then consider, should the suspension entitle you to an extension of time in order to perform that obligation? Let's look at a practical example together now. Good Supply Limited enters into a contract with 𝗣𝗿𝗂𝘀𝗀𝗀𝗀 Customer Limited. Several of customers' invoices are long overdue and it is impacting badly on supplier's cash flow. Despite this, customer insists that supplier continue their work. What can go right for the supplier in this situation? Well, let's say that the supplier anticipated this risk and included in the contract a right to be able to suspend if the customer does not make payment on time. So in this scenario, the supplier would probably inform the customer that they have a right to suspend to try and prompt the customer to make that payment promptly. But if the customer doesn't make that payment promptly, then the supplier would have the right to issue their notification of suspension and to discontinue their performance of the work until such time as their customer makes the payment. What could go wrong from the perspective of the supplier? Well, if they do not have a contractual right to suspend when the customer fails to make payment, then life's going to be a lot more difficult. That supplier might have to try and convince or look for solutions which would enable the customer to make the payment or force the customer to make payment. Potentially, the supplier can check the law that governs the contract. Are they able to pursue a court order or pursue some other form of dispute resolution in order to force the customer to make payment based on the law that governs the contract? But this is a less clean methodology, and pursuing a claim via the courts or via the alternative form of dispute resolution that the parties might agree in the contract would not necessarily guarantee payment or the solution that the supplier is looking for. Let's look at a sample clause and some key considerations now, and firstly to the clause. Customer, supplier, or either party, whatever you choose, may suspend the contract if the supplier, customer, or other party is in breach of a material obligation and does not begin and diligently continue remedial work within the timeframe that you choose of receiving notice of the breach. This is an example of clause that would entitle a party to the contract to suspend due to a default of the contract by the other party. The first point for you to consider is whether the right to suspend should apply just for one or for both of the contract parties. Then, in what circumstances should the right to suspend arise? You can see the sample clause talks about there being a breach of a material obligation, but what does that mean in practice? You can make material obligation a defined term and set out the exact circumstances that would amount to a breach of a material obligation. But for a customer who has an obligation to make payment, their non-payment could be an example of a breach of a material obligation. Or if you're looking at a supplier who has an obligation to perform services to a certain standard, one might say that their failure to perform the services to that standard or a failure to perform the services at all could be a breach of that material obligation. Next, in an ideal world, it wouldn't be necessary to suspend the contract, so the parties would often agree, rather than having an immediate right to suspend, that you'd provide notification to the other party of their breach of the material obligation, so that they have an opportunity to fix that problem before you actually suspend the contract. So give that some thought. What would be an appropriate time period to give to the other party for them to fix the problem that you've identified? The sample clause continues, the party in default will pay the additional reasonable costs of the suspending party that arise due to their suspension. At first glance, we might think that this clause is entirely fair, because if I've had to suspend the contract due to your breach of a material obligation, and I consequently incur costs, then it seems reasonable that you as the defaulting party would pay compensation to me. However, if there's no cap on liability in the contract, or if there's no consequential loss disclaimer, your liability could end up being quite considerable, so be careful with this type of clause. I hope you found this introductory content helpful, but if you're ready for the next step to learn how to negotiate and use contracts with confidence, then check out our website starlitcontracts.com, where you can become a member to access additional content, interactive sessions, and be part of our community. I look forward to seeing you there.